Gaza. An Inquest into Its Martyrdom by Norman G. Finkelstein. Audiobook by the Learner's Library. Contents. Part 3. The Mavi Marmara. Chapter 7 Murder on the High Seas. Chapter 8 Whitewash I, the Turkel Report. Chapter 9 Whitewash II, the UN Panel Report. Part 3. The Mavi Marmara. Chapter 7. Murder on the High Seas. The devastation inflicted on Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, 2008-9, was designed to exacerbate the effects of the ongoing illegal blockade. I fully expected to see serious damage, but I have to say I was really shocked when I saw the extent and precision of the destruction, the World Food Programme director for the Strip observed after the assault. It was precisely the strategic economic areas that Gaza depends on to relieve its dependency on aid that were wiped out. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, destroyed critical civilian infrastructure, such as the only operative flour mill and nearly all of the cement factories, in the hope and expectation that after a ceasefire went into effect, Gazans would be reduced to abject dependency and couldn't rebuild their lives unless and until they bowed to Israeli diktat. A year and a half after Cast Lead, major humanitarian and human rights organizations uniformly attested that Gaza continued to suffer a humanitarian crisis on account of the siege. Contrary to what the Israeli government states, the humanitarian aid allowed into Gaza is only a fraction of what is needed to answer the enormous needs of an exhausted people. Oxfam, the blockade, has severely damaged the economy, leaving 70 to 80% of Gazans in poverty. Human Rights Watch, Israel is blocking vital medical supplies from entering the Gaza Strip. World Health Organization. The closure is having a devastating impact on the 1.5 million people living in Gaza. International Committee of the Red Cross. Still, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu proclaimed that there was no humanitarian crisis and no lack of medicines or other essential items in Gaza. We mustn't tire of reminding others, Parisian media philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy chimed in, that the blockade concerns only arms and the material needed to manufacture them. Mocking the reports of a humanitarian crisis, Deputy Foreign Minister Danny Ayalon gestured to Gaza's sparkling new shopping mall, new Olympic-sized swimming pool, 5-star hotels and restaurants. To assuage public opinion, Israel disseminated photographs of these lavish scenes on the internet. Tiny pockets of Gaza did in fact prosper. Harvard political economist Sarah Roy noted the emergence of a thin economic stratum that had grown extremely wealthy from the black market economy, and the almost perverse consumerism in restaurants and shops that are the domain of the wealthy. However appalling, such a juxtaposition should scarcely come as a shock, at any rate to students of Jewish history. The sword of the Nazi extermination policy hung over all Jews equally, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto recalled. But a social differentiation arose in the ghetto, setting apart substantial groups who had the means even under those infernal conditions to lead a comparatively full, well-fed life and enjoy some kinds of pleasures. On the same streets where daily you could see scenes of horror, amid the swarms of tubercular children dying like flies, you would come upon stores full of fine foods, restaurants and cafes, which served the most expensive dishes and drinks. The clientele of these places consisted principally of Jewish Gestapo agents, Jewish police officials, rich merchants who did business with the Germans, smugglers, dealers in foreign exchange and similar kinds of people. He went on to note, the Nazis made moving pictures of such festive orgies to show the world how well the Jews lived in the ghetto. The consensus among human rights and humanitarian organizations was that the Israeli blockade of Gaza constituted a form of collective punishment in flagrant violation of international law. A misplaced controversy unfolded between Israel's critics and supporters as to whether the blockade had put Gazans on a starvation, critics, or a starvation plus supporters regimen. The terms of this debate diverted attention from and obscured the fundamental point. What right did Israel have to put the people of Gaza on any diet? Even critics of the siege seconded Israel's right to prevent weapons from entering Gaza. But if Palestinians acquiesced in the legally mandated terms for resolving the conflict, did international law in fact debar them from using armed force or acquiring weapons to end the occupation? The salient points of law were these. First, in a 2004 advisory opinion, the International Court of Justice stated that, as regards the principle of the right of peoples to self-determination, the court observes that the existence of a Palestinian people is no longer in issue, that the Palestinian people's rights include the right to self-determination, and that Israel is bound to comply with its obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Second, the territorial unit within which this Palestinian right of self-determination was to be exercised clearly includes the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Third, international law prohibited use of military force by an administering power to suppress widespread popular insurrection in a self-determination unit, while the use of force by a non-state entity in exercise of a right of self-determination is legally neutral, that is, not regulated by international law at all, and assistance by states to local insurgents in a self-determination unit may be permissible. Fourth, it might be contended that the legal situation in the occupied Palestinian territories was regulated, not by the right of self-determination but, instead, by the law of belligerent occupation, that belligerent occupation is not designed to win the hearts and minds of the local inhabitants, it has military, or security, objectives and its foundation is the power of the bayonet, that, consequently, the civilian population in an occupied territory did not have the right to forcibly resist an occupying power. However, even if Israel did legally qualify as a belligerent occupier, the Israel-Palestine conflict would nonetheless be one of those situations in which belligerent occupation and wars of national liberation overlap, and the right of national liberation/self-determination is a peremptory norm of international law, from which no derogation is permissible. This peremptory right would thus limit the ambit of the law of belligerent occupation, in particular, its strictures on use of force, in hybrid or overlapping situations. The upshot was that the Palestinian right to self-determination trumped whatever rights Israel might have accrued as a belligerent occupier. Fifth, in fact, however, by refusing to negotiate in good faith an end to the conflict, Israel had forfeited any rights it might have invoked under the law of belligerent occupation. It could then legally lay claim to one and only one right, to withdraw, while no law debarred Palestinians from using force or acquiring weapons from friendly states to effect that withdrawal. It was a measure of how degraded international law had become that rights and obligations were inverted. The tacit premise of public discourse was that Israel had a right to use armed force, while Palestinians had an obligation to disarm. Even if, for argument's sake, international law did prohibit the Palestinian people from resort to armed resistance, the fact still remained that, as Amnesty International urged, if on different grounds, an arms embargo should have been imposed on both Hamas and Israel. It would be a curious conception of justice that denied the victims the wherewithal to resist, even as they supported the legally mandated norms for achieving peace, but enabled the perpetrators to replenish their arsenal of repression even as they rejected these norms and rode roughshod over them. On May 31, 2010, a humanitarian flotilla en route to Gaza and carrying 700 passengers came under attack in international waters by Israeli commandos. The flotilla's 6 vessels were delivering 10,000 tons of badly needed supplies to Gaza's beleaguered population. By the end of the Israeli assault in the middle of the night, 9 passengers aboard the flagship Mavi Marmara had been shot to death. If Cast Lead was a turning point in the attitude of the world towards us, Haaretz columnist Gideon Levy-Rude, this operation is the second horror film of the apparently ongoing series. Still, ever the public relations maestro, Israel managed to spin the commandos as the victims of the attack. In a solipsistic paroxysm of indignation, and with nary a peep of dissent, Israeli officials and media across the political spectrum proclaimed that the commandos were initially armed only with paintball rifles and resorted to aggressive tactics. As a last resort, in self-defense, they had been provoked, ambushed, duped, lynched, and lured into a trap set by a phalanx of radical anti-Western, machete-wielding, bloodthirsty jihadists and mercenaries linked with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. Israeli vilification zeroed in on Mavi Marmara passengers belonging to Insani Yardım Vakfi, IHH, the Turkish group that sponsored the vessel. IHH was branded a terrorist, or terrorist-affiliated, organization. But in an Israeli information packet distributed just before the commando raid, IHH had been benignly depicted as a Turkish pro-Palestinian human rights organization with a strong Muslim orientation, which provides humanitarian relief into areas of war and conflict. The soldiers were beaten, Nobel Peace Prize laureate and Israeli President Shimon Peres solemnly intoned, just because they did not want to kill anyone. You fought morally, and showed valor in your acts, he then told the commandos. I salute you and admire your courage and restraint even in the face of danger to your own lives. Israel's ambassador to Spain likened the Mavi Marmara passengers to Islamic terrorists who had killed scores of commuters on Madrid trains in 2004, while bracketing the 9 civilians killed aboard the vessel with the 23 Spaniards who died on the roads this weekend. Some 90% of Israeli Jews supported the decision to stop the flotilla and believed that Israel used the right amount, or not enough force, while only 16% supported lifting the siege of Gaza. One of the commandos responsible for killing multiple passengers was reportedly in line for a Medal of Valor, while Deputy Prime Minister Eli Ishai exhorted Defense Minister Ehud Barak to award medals to all the commandos. The exact sequence of events on that fateful night will probably never be known for certain. But even if it were, it wouldn't materially affect the assignation of blame. If Israel sought to justify its attack on the Mavi Marmara on the grounds of self-defense, it came up against the tenet of law that no legal benefit or right could be derived from an illegal act, ex injuria non oritur jus. In the instant case, Israel couldn't claim a right of self-defense if its resort to violent force was triggered by its enforcement of the illegal blockade. The passengers aboard a convoy in international waters carrying humanitarian relief to a desperate population did, however, have every right to use force in self-defense against a pirate-like raid. What's more, when Israel attacked the flotilla, it did not harbor a fear that illegal contraband was on board. The flotilla leadership offered to let a neutral body, such as the International Red Cross, verify beforehand the humanitarian nature of the cargo. It appears that the contents had already been rigorously inspected at departure, while Israeli officials neither evinced interest in searching the flotilla's cargo nor even pretended that the ships were transporting weapons to Gaza. A provocation took place off the coast of Gaza, but the provocateurs were not the peace activists. Veteran Israeli dissident Yuri Avneri declared. The provocation was carried out by Navy ships and commandos, blocking the way of the aid boats and using deadly force. If Israeli officials proclaimed after Cast Lead that they had acted lunatic in order to deter their enemies, then it was cause for concern after the commando raid whether they had in fact become lunatic. Only a crazy government that has lost all restraint and all connection to reality, Avneri went on to say, could do something like that. Consider ships carrying humanitarian aid and peace activists from around the world as an enemy and send massive military force to international waters to attack them, shoot and kill. Even as some points of contention remained murky, insofar as the facts could be ascertained, the vast preponderance of Israeli allegations did not hold up to scrutiny. The attacking force did not initially use only paintball guns. On the contrary, Israeli combatants in Zodiacs abutting the Mavi Marmara opened fire with tear gas, smoke and stun grenades, and maybe plastic bullets, and then helicopters hovering above the vessel opened fire with live ammunition before any commando had rappelled on deck. The passengers did not belong to terrorist organizations, nor did they lay a lethal trap. On the contrary, they did not even prepare for injuries, did not possess firearms or discharge captured ones, and did not carry on them monies paid to murder Israelis. The Israeli commandos held by passengers did not endure a lynching. On the contrary, they were provided medical care and then escorted for release. The Israeli commandos did not fire with restraint and only in self-defense. On the contrary, they killed the 9 passengers by shooting all but one of them multiple times, 5 were shot in the head, and at least 6 of the 9 were killed in a manner consistent with an extralegal, arbitrary, and summary execution. The conduct of the Israeli military and other personnel towards the flotilla passengers was not only disproportionate to the occasion, a prestigious UN fact-finding mission concluded, but demonstrated levels of totally unnecessary and incredible violence. It betrayed an unacceptable level of brutality. Shortly after release of the UN report, however, Prime Minister Netanyahu praised the crucial, essential, important and legal assault and saluted the Israeli commandos, who acted courageously, morally and with restraint, against those who came to kill you, and tried to kill you. There is no one better than you. To be sure, Israeli officials did acknowledge room for operational improvement when the next flotilla is boarded by the Navy. Attack dogs will be the first to board the decks, to prevent harm to soldiers. They are strong and merciless. It was unclear whether contingency plans had been put in place should passengers dupe and lynch the canines. Meanwhile, the semi-official Israeli Intelligence and Terrorism Information Center noted in apparent extenuation of the killings, that as many as 7 of the 9 dead passengers might have sought martyrdom. The last diary entry of one of them, for example, expressed a willingness to die for a noble cause. Before being hung by the British in 1775, American revolutionary Nathan Hale famously regretted having but one life to lose for my country. Gandhi exhorted his followers to actively court martyrdom. It would exhilarate me to hear that a co-worker was shot dead or that another co-worker had had his skull broken. Does a man's preparedness to make the ultimate sacrifice for a greater good justify killing him? If so many Westerners initially swallowed the topsy-turvy Israeli storyline, it was because the Hasbara propaganda campaign had been so carefully rehearsed and adeptly executed, while the Western media lapped up the Israeli spin. In an operation reminiscent of the first week or so of Operation Cast Lead, Anthony Lehrman observed in the British Guardian, the Israeli PR machine succeeded in getting the major news outlets to focus on its version of events, and to use the Israeli authorities' discourse for a crucial 48 hours. The only witnesses able to contest the official Israeli account had been imprisoned and their photographic evidence confiscated. But the Israeli propaganda offensive eventually began to unravel, and international opinion, including wide swaths of Jewish opinion, swung sharply in the reverse direction. Israel then contended that if some people saw things differently, it traced back to the eternal war against the Jewish people, and the fact that Israeli officialdom had dropped the ball on the PR front. The international community turned hostile, according to the influential Reut Institute, because of successful efforts to brand Israel as an occupying and aggressive entity that ignores and undermines human rights and international law, whereas the flotillas were branded in the context of resistance to occupation and oppression, the promotion of peace and human rights, a moral response to Gaza's humanitarian crisis, and in the spirit of international law. In other words, if Israel's image had suffered yet another blow, its cause was not the sordid underlying reality but, instead, the distorted branding of it. Despite the groundswell of public outrage, the United States lent Israel blind support throughout its latest diplomatic imbroglio. President Barack Obama merely expressed deep regret at the loss of life, while his administration shielded Israel from accountability at international forums. Vice President Joseph Biden defended the commando raid on the grounds that, if the flotilla had just unloaded the cargo at an Israeli port, Israel would have been ready, willing, and able to transfer it to Gaza. In a bizarre sequence of non-sequiturs, Biden alternately asserted that Israel was blocking passage of supplies such as building materials, and that the flotilla could have easily brought them in. Meanwhile, the U.S. representative at an emergency session of the UN Security Council shamelessly denied that Israel had prevented vital goods from reaching Gaza. Mechanisms exist for the transfer of humanitarian assistance to Gaza by member states and groups that want to do so. 87 of the U.S. Senate's 100 members signed a letter to Obama declaring that they fully support Israel's right of self-defense after the Israeli commandos arrived on the Mavi Marmara and were brutally attacked. The U.S. House of Representatives followed suit, as 338 of its 435 members signed a letter expressing strong support for Israel's right to defend itself after passengers on the ship attacked Israeli soldiers with clubs, metal rods, and iron bars. Congressional leaders, acting at the behest of Jewish groups, moved to officially designate not the perpetrators but the victims of the attack as terrorists, and the sponsors of the humanitarian mission as a terrorist organization. They also sought to bar survivors of the bloodbath entry into the United States on the grounds that they should not be allowed to come and spill their propaganda and hatred and terrorist rhetoric. Since the Palestinians in Gaza elected Hamas, New York Senator Chuck Schumer told a meeting of Orthodox Jews after the attack, it made sense to strangle them economically until they see that's not the way to go. On the other hand, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and other Western officials, alongside the UN Security Council as a whole, experienced an epiphany. On the morning after the flotilla horror, they proclaimed that Israel's siege of Gaza was unsustainable and had to be lifted. Still, as the crisis group pointedly observed, international condemnation and calls for an inquiry will come easily, but many who will issue them must acknowledge their own role in the deplorable treatment of Gaza that formed the backdrop to the Israeli raid. Fully 3/4 of the damage and destruction Israel wreaked during Cast Lead had not yet been repaired or rebuilt when the flotilla embarked on its humanitarian mission. Although Israel promised after the flotilla carnage and attendant international outcry to ease restrictions on some goods bound for Gaza, it still banned items necessary to restore Gaza's manufacturing sector, and put onerous conditions on the entry of critical building materials. The burdens on the entrance of construction materials, an Israeli human rights organization warned, could turn the promise of allowing reconstruction into a dead letter. UN officials estimated that under Israeli restrictions still in place, it would take 75 years to rebuild Gaza. In late 2010, nearly a half-year after Israel's publicized commitment to relax the siege, a consortium of more than 20 respected human rights and humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza grimly reported that there are few signs of real improvement on the ground as the ease has left foundations of the illegal blockade policy intact. Gaza requires 670,000 truckloads of construction material, while only an average of 715 of these truckloads have been received per month. The private sector is excluded from the possibility to import construction materials including concrete, steel, and gravel, hampering efforts of people in Gaza to rebuild their homes, businesses, and other property. Exports remain banned, and except for the humanitarian activity of exporting a small amount of strawberries, not a single truck has left Gaza since the easing. Many humanitarian items, including vital water equipment, that are not on the Israeli restricted list continue to receive no permits. Ordinary Gaza residents are still denied access to their friends and family, and to educational opportunities in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and abroad. Access to around 35% of Gaza's farmland and 85% of maritime areas for fishing remains restricted by the Israeli buffer zone, with devastating impact on the economy and people's rights and livelihoods. 39% of Gaza residents remain unemployed, while 80% of the population remains dependent upon international aid. There cannot be a just and durable resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the authoritative report concluded, without an end to the isolation and punishment of people in Gaza. Israel curtly dismissed the report as biased and distorted. Even if, for argument's sake, Israel's right to block the passage of the flotilla were credited, it still wouldn't explain why, on a supposedly peaceful interception, its commandos chose to board the ship by rappelling from a military helicopter, in the dark, in international waters. Indeed, Israel elected a modus operandi practically guaranteed to induce panic and mayhem. It could easily have chosen, as Israeli officials conceded, from an array of relatively benign options, such as disabling the propeller, rudder, or engine of the vessel and towing it to the Israeli port at Ashdod, or physically blocking the vessel's passage. Passengers aboard the flotilla anticipated that, if we fail to stop, they will probably knock out our propellers or rudders, then tow us somewhere for repair. To go by Israel's own official alibi, a commando raid was a bizarre choice. It purported after the bloodletting that it hadn't foreseen violent resistance. It was expecting mild violence and mostly curses, shoves and spitting in the face, a sit-down, a linking of arms, passive resistance, perhaps verbal resistance, or to engage with the passengers in conversation. But if Israel didn't expect a violent reception, why didn't it intercept the Mavi Marmara in broad daylight, with a full complement of journalists in tow, to show the world its peaceful intentions? Why did it disable the vessel's communications beforehand, preventing transmissions to the outside world? Why did it initiate contact by using tear gas, smoke, and stun grenades, and possibly plastic bullets? If it anticipated chit-chatting with passengers, why did it deploy a commando unit trained to kill and not a police unit accustomed to handling civil resistors? To judge by its pre-planning, the reasonable inference is that Israel sought a bloody confrontation, although probably not on the scale that ensued. What did the commandos expect pro-Palestinian activists to do once they boarded the ships? The British Guardian editorialized, "Invite them aboard for a cup of tea with the captain on the bridge." Still, the mystery remains: why did Israel launch a violent assault? In fact, multiple factors converged to make a commando raid the optimal operational plan. Prior to the flotilla attack, Israel had conducted a succession of bungled operations. It suffered a major military setback in 2006 when it invaded Lebanon and tangled with Hezbollah. It undertook to restore its deterrence capacity in 2008-9 when it invaded Gaza. Yet the attack evoked not awe at Israel's martial prowess but outrage at its lethal cowardice. It dispatched in 2010 a commando team to assassinate a Hamas leader in Dubai, but even as it accomplished its mission, the unit ended up seeding a diplomatic storm on account of its amateurish execution. Israel was desperate to restore the IDF's daring-do image of bygone years. What better way than an Entebbe-like commando raid? The decision to launch the assault on the Mavi Marmara was taken jointly by Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Barak. Both had belonged to a commando unit in their youth. Barak was Netanyahu's commander and mentor in the unit. A commando raid in 1973 made Barak's reputation, while Netanyahu basked in the reflected glory of his brother Jonathan, who was the only Israeli casualty on the Entebbe raid. Their intersecting personal histories primed Barak and Netanyahu to opt for a violent commando assault, in order to burnish the IDF's, and, not incidentally, their own, reputation. Both of them were dyed-in-the-wool creatures of military operations, a Haaretz columnist noted after the flotilla raid, steeped in the instant heroism mentality and the commando spirit, in which a military force shows up at the height of a crisis like a deus ex machina, and in a single stroke slices through the Gordian knot. Unsurprisingly, of the 6 ships in the flotilla, Israel targeted the Mavi Marmara for special treatment. Some 2/3 of its 600 passengers were Turkish citizens. The vessel's core group was alleged to be a front for a radical Islamist organization, probably with links to the ruling party in Turkey, which made it a yet more tempting target. In recent times, Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan had become increasingly determined to carve out an independent foreign policy, and had been outspoken in his criticism of Israel. A diplomatic tit-for-tat ensued. Erdogan publicly dressed down President Perez at the World Economic Forum right after cast lead, "When it comes to killing, you know well how to kill." Deputy Foreign Minister Ayalon publicly humiliated the Turkish ambassador in early 2010 by refusing to shake his hand in front of Israeli television cameras, and seating him on a sofa over which the Israeli minister towered. Erdogan then seized the initiative, in concert with Brazil, to resolve diplomatically the impasse with Iran over its nuclear program. Israel bridled at the Turkish démarche, as it was hell-bent on a military solution. Just days before the flotilla attack, Netanyahu would later recall, Turkey had strengthened its identification and cooperation with Iran. When Ankara ignored Tel Aviv's counsel to preempt the Mavi Marmara, it was the last straw. It was long past time to cut the Turkish upstart down to size, and a sleek, if sanguinary, commando raid was just the reminder Erdogan needed of who was in charge in that corner of the world. If Israel eschewed less violent options to halt the flotilla, an Israeli strategic analyst elucidated, it was because it needed to tell the Islamizing Turkey, no more. The forces of the Ottoman Empire, who aspire to again rule the Middle East as they did almost 500 years ago, will be stopped at Gaza's shores. The rift that opened up with Israel's historic ally appeared to belie such speculation. Why would it risk such a steep diplomatic price? But Israel had grown accustomed to Arab Muslim leaders meekly absorbing its humiliating blows. If Israeli commandos had killed 9 Egyptians on a humanitarian convoy, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak would almost certainly have turned a blind eye. Even Syrian President Bashar al-Assad stayed mute after an Israeli air assault in 2007 destroyed an alleged Syrian nuclear reactor. I am certain the Turkish reaction took the Zionist leaders by surprise, Hezbollah Secretary-General Sayed Hassan Nasrallah shrewdly observed. The commando raid was additionally designed to stem the rising tide of humanitarian vessels destined for Gaza. Israel initially allowed ships carrying supplies to quietly pass through the blockade, hoping that the spirits of the organizers would peter out as public interest flagged. When the organizers persisted, the Israeli Navy rammed and intercepted vessels en route to Gaza. But more ships kept coming. After Israel blocked a humanitarian vessel from reaching Gaza in 2009, a British-led delegation worried out loud to U.S. embassy officials in Beirut that the Israeli government would not be as lenient in the future should similar incidents occur. If the assault on the flotilla couldn't have shocked those inside the diplomatic loop, it didn't shock seasoned observers of the Israeli scene either. The violent interception of civilian vessels carrying humanitarian aid, Israeli novelist Amos Oz reflected, was the rank product of the Israeli mantra that what can't be done by force can be done with even greater force. To fortify its claim that the commandos' violence was spontaneous, Israel gestured to the fact that it had merely expected resistance like we encounter in Bil'in. But Israel had often resorted to deliberate lethal force in order to suppress such civil resistance. What happened aboard the Mavi Marmara, a Haaretz columnist observed, was very similar to what Israel has been doing every week for the past 4 years in Bil'in, injuring and killing unarmed civilian protesters who are demanding their basic rights. The assault on the Mavi Marmara turned into yet another bungled operation, as the once vaunted IDF seemed increasingly to resemble the gang that cannot shoot straight. The mishandling of this latest military operation could not be swept under the rug. Although Israeli Hasbara desperately spun the raid as an operational success, and the commandos as untarnished heroes, few were taken in. The pundit class deplored this disgraceful fiasco and national humiliation in which deterrence took a bad blow. The magic evaporated long ago. The most moral army in the world, that was once the best army in the world, failed again, Gideon Levy ironically observed. More and more there is the impression that nearly everything it touches causes harm to Israel. Indeed, the naval commandos constituted Israel's best fighting unit, and had rehearsed the attack for weeks, even constructing a model of the Mavi Marmara. Nonetheless, when 30 of these commandos faced off against an equal number of civilian passengers with only makeshift weapons in hand, 3 of them allowed themselves to be captured, and photographs of them being nursed circulated throughout cyberspace. Israeli soldiers, let alone elite commandos, were not supposed to be taken alive. The last thing Israel needed was a Gilad Shalit redux. The claim made by the IDF spokesman that the soldiers' lives were in danger and they feared a lynching, a respected military analyst understated, is hardly complimentary to the men of the elite naval units. The images of a cowering and inept fighting force could not have comforted the domestic population either. Would it grow jittery about the IDF's ability, after so many fiascos, to fend off a seemingly endless list of ever more potent enemies? It's one thing for people to think you're crazy, an Israeli general rude, but it's bad when they think you're incompetent and crazy, and that's the way we look. A 2010 poll of the Arab world, which showed that only 12% of the Arab public believed Israel was very powerful, while fully 44% believed it was weaker than it looks, couldn't have allayed Israeli anxieties. Each disastrous mission upped the stakes of the next throw of the dice. It appeared as if Israel would sooner rather than later have to launch a yet more spectacular mission to compensate for the long string of failures. An Israeli general declared after Cast Lead that the IDF would continue to apply the so-called Da'iyah doctrine of directing massive force against civilian infrastructure in the future. The essence of Israeli strategic doctrine, the IDF Deputy Chief of Staff elaborated, was that each new round of fighting brings worse results than the last to Israel's enemies. Lebanon loomed at the time as Israel's next target. But Hezbollah had amassed a deterrence capacity of its own. Israel was unwilling to risk the massive civilian casualties that would ensue in the event of an attack. At the end of the day, defenseless Gaza would continue to be Israel's preferred punching bag. The 9 passengers killed aboard the Mavi Marmara were the first casualties of the Goldstone report's interment. If it had not been effectively vetoed, Palestinian human rights lawyer Raji Sawarani observed, if the international community had fulfilled its obligation to enforce international humanitarian law, and if the rule of law were respected, it is almost certain that the unjustifiable bloodshed in the Mediterranean could have been prevented. However, although Israel managed to clear the Goldstone hurdle, it now had to contend with the new international outcry after the commando raid. Not for the first time, it decided to appoint a commission of inquiry to investigate the incident. The expectation was that by blending judicial gravitas with craven subservience to the state, such an investigation would placate international opinion or, at any rate, those portions of it that counted. The commission did not disappoint. Chapter 8. Whitewash 1. The Turkel Report. In June 2010, Israel established an independent public commission to investigate the maritime incident of May 31, 2010. In January 2011, the commission, chaired by former Israeli Supreme Court Justice Jacob Turkel, released its findings. The Turkel Report, running to nearly 300 pages, exonerated Israel of culpability for the carnage aboard the Mavi Marmara and, instead, pinned blame on a cadre of passengers who had allegedly plotted and armed themselves to kill the Israeli commandos. The report divided into 2 principal sections, a legal analysis of the Israeli blockade, and a factual reconstruction of the events that climaxed in the violence. It began, however, by recounting the historical context of the Israeli blockade. These passages of the report provided instructive insight into its objectivity. The report stated that in October 2000 violent incidents broke out in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which were given the name, the Second Intifada. In these, suicide attacks were restarted in cities in Israeli territory. Its capsule description of the Second Intifada omitted mention that Israel had used massive, indiscriminate, and lethal firepower to quell largely non-violent demonstrations, and that Palestinians endured 5 months of bloodletting before they resorted to suicide attacks. The report began by highlighting that, since the beginning of 2001, thousands of mortars and rockets of various kinds have been fired in ever-growing numbers from the Gaza Strip. But this depiction ignored that Israel directed far more lethal firepower at Gaza during the same period. Although the report did concede that human rights and humanitarian organizations, as well as a leading Israeli jurist, had concluded that Gaza remained occupied after Israel's 2005 disengagement, it nevertheless sustained the contrary position of the Israeli government. The report asserted that the June 2008 ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, collapsed in December 2008 when the rocket and mortar attacks against Israel recommenced. In fact, as Amnesty International observed at the time, the lull broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on November 4, 2008. The report thus skewed the critical historical context wholly in Israel's favor. The Turkel Report upheld the legality of the Israeli blockade of Gaza on dual grounds. 1. The people of Gaza didn't experience starvation and their physical survival wasn't at risk, and 2. Whatever hardship Gaza's civilian population did endure was the collateral and proportional damage of a blockade targeting Hamas's military capabilities. If Gazans weren't starving and their essential needs were met, then the blockade was legal. The Turkel Report juxtaposed the consensus opinion of human rights and humanitarian organizations that Israel's siege of Gaza had caused a humanitarian crisis with Israel's denial of such a crisis. It resolved these two very different perceptions of reality by concluding, for example, that even if 60% of Gazans did experience food insecurity, still Israel met its legal obligations inasmuch as the people weren't dying of starvation but were merely hungry. The report approvingly quoted Israeli officials to the effect that, "No one has ever stated that the population of the Gaza Strip is starving." It went on to defend the siege's legality on the grounds that food insecurity does not equate to starvation. Prima facie, it would be odd if current international law, which accords so many safeguards to civilians in times of war and under occupation, sanctioned a just shy of genocidal policy. Indeed, seemingly cognizant that such a legal standard was too lax, not to mention cruel, coming from an esteemed former Supreme Court justice, the report simultaneously purported that even if the law kicked in not just for starvation, but also for the less exigent condition of hunger, and even if the siege did induce hunger, still Israel wasn't deliberately inducing hunger, and if it wasn't a willful policy, Israel wasn't legally culpable. The Commission found no evidence that Israel is trying to deprive the population of the Gaza Strip of food. But if the foreseeable and inevitable effect of barring foodstuffs from entering Gaza was to cause hunger, it is hard to make out how the punitive outcome was mere happenstance and not Israel's intention. Or, put otherwise, for want of trying to induce hunger, Israel was awfully good at it. Just as it exonerated Israel of denying Gazans food, so the Turkel Report exonerated Israel of denying Gazans other objects essential for the survival of the civilian population. It acknowledged that Israel blocked entry of construction materials but rationalized this policy on the grounds that, according to intelligence information, Hamas might use them for military purposes. The report made short shrift of the possibility that the motive behind this ban was to punish the people of Gaza. It is clear that the restrictions were not imposed in order to prevent the use of these materials by the civilian population. One searched in vain, however, for proof of this confident assertion. What's more, the report contended both that Israel denied entry of essential objects, such as construction materials, but only on security grounds, and that there was no evidence Israel denied entry of such essential objects. The report further stated that no evidence was presented that Israel prevents the passage of medical supplies apart from those included in the list of materials whose entry into the Gaza Strip is prohibited for security reasons. Yet that Israeli list included vital medical supplies, according to the World Health Organization, such as X-ray machines, electronic imaging scanners, laboratory equipment, and basic items, such as elevators for hospitals. If Israel was depriving Gazans of vital medical supplies, then it was denying them objects essential to their survival. The report also inconsistently alleged both that Israel had denied entry of essential objects on security grounds, and that Israel allowed entry of many of these same objects, apparently without jeopardizing its security, after the flotilla attack evoked international outrage. The report, finally, never attended to the obvious question: why did so many respected human rights and humanitarian organizations sound the alarm of a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, if none existed? The upshot was, the Turkel Report alleged that Israel's blockade did not breach humanitarian law on the bizarre ground that Gazans weren't literally starving to death, that if the legal threshold was causing hunger, then Israel didn't deliberately cause hunger, even if hunger was the inevitable and predictable result of its blockade, that Israel did prevent entry of essential construction materials, and that it categorically did not prevent entry of essential construction materials, and that Israel did not prevent entry of vital medical supplies, even if it did prevent entry of vital medical supplies. If the report managed to prove the blockade was legal, it was, alas, at the price of sacrificing logic, consistency, and fact. If the harm to Gaza's civilian population was proportional and collateral, then the blockade was legal. The Turkel Report applied a proportionality test to the blockade. It found that if Gazans did endure hardship as a result of the Israeli siege, it constituted collateral damage, proportional to the security objective of degrading Hamas's military capabilities. Although it occasionally suggested that the blockade was more than just a security measure, the report was emphatic that it did not target the civilian population. In one of its various formulations, the report depicted the siege as having two goals: a security goal of preventing the entry of weapons, ammunition, and military supplies into the Gaza Strip, and a broader strategic goal of indirect economic warfare, whose purpose is to restrict Hamas's economic ability as the body in control of the Gaza Strip to take military action against Israel. The report further found that Israel was not guilty of inflicting collective punishment, because there is nothing in the evidence that suggests that Israel is intentionally placing restrictions on goods for the sole or primary purpose of denying them to the population of Gaza. But if the intent of the Israeli siege was to degrade Hamas's military capacity, not to harm Gaza's civilian population, surely it was cause for wonder why Israel severely restricted entry of goods not considered essential for the basic subsistence of the population, and why it allowed passage of only a humanitarian minimum of civilian goods. It was also cause for puzzlement why Israeli officials kept repeating privately that they intended to keep the Gazan economy on the brink of collapse without quite pushing it over the edge. In other words, why was the blockade calibrated so as to keep Gaza's civilian population teetering on the precipice, if the civilian population was not being targeted? Although tediously repetitive and replete with minutiae on arcane points of law, the report was notably silent on exactly what items Israel interdicted to thwart Hamas's offensive capabilities. It omitted that the seemingly endless list of verboten items included sage, coriander, ginger, jam, halva, vinegar, nutmeg, chocolate, fruit preserves, seeds and nuts, biscuits, potato chips, musical instruments, notebooks, writing implements, toys, chicks, and goats. The purpose of the economic warfare in the Gaza Strip, the report asseverated, was to undermine Hamas's ability to attack Israel and its citizens. The non-security-related restrictions on the passage of goods, such as the restrictions upon certain food products, are a part of this strategy. Neither the facts nor the legal reasoning presented in the Turkel Report refuted the consensus opinion that Gaza was experiencing a humanitarian crisis, that the Israeli siege was causing the humanitarian crisis, that Israel was deliberately causing this humanitarian crisis, that the Israeli siege consequently constituted an illegal form of collective punishment, and that the use of force against the humanitarian flotilla, insofar as it was designed to prolong the illegal siege, was also illegal. The second half of the Turkel Report reconstructed the events that climaxed in the killing of 9 passengers aboard the Mavi Marmara by Israeli commandos. The report cleared Israel of legal culpability for the violence and deaths and, instead, pinned responsibility on a cadre of passengers who allegedly plotted and armed themselves in advance to kill Israelis. It also determined that the lethal use of force by the Israeli commandos constituted justifiable self-defense. The Turkel Report's major conclusions diametrically opposed those of an eminent UN fact-finding mission. Without access to the evidence on which each side based its conclusions, a third party would be hard-pressed to definitively decide between them. Nonetheless, on the basis of their internal coherence and judged against uncontested facts, it is possible to render a judgment on which of the findings are more persuasive. On a preliminary point, the sources on which the Turkel Report leaned prompt skepticism. The government resolution mandating the Turkel Commission excused IDF, Israel Defense Forces, soldiers, from testifying before it. The report accordingly had to depend on soldiers' statements that were only documented in writing and submitted to the Commission. The report deemed the commando testimonies credible and trustworthy because the soldiers gave detailed information, used natural language, and did not appear to have coordinated their versions. It puzzled what evidentiary value should be attached to the written submissions. Natural language. Did it enhance the commandos' credibility that they reflexively called everyone who crossed their paths on the Mavi Marmara a terrorist? It was also unclear how the Commission could determine whether or not the commandos coordinated beforehand their written submissions. The report stated that the soldiers' accounts were examined meticulously, cross-referenced against each other. Was it so far-fetched that the soldiers also examined meticulously, cross-referenced, each other's statements before submitting them? It was not even clear that prescribed protocol barred such prior coordination. Indeed, the soldiers could infer prior to giving testimony that they would not suffer judicial penalties for perjury, or even undergo rigorous interrogation. The soldiers were not put on notice that their rights were implicated when giving their statements, and they did not undergo cross-examination. In general, the Commission invested enormous faith in the testimony of Israeli civilian and military officials, even as respected Israeli commentators had ridiculed their record of truth-telling. Except for the oral testimony of 2 Israeli Palestinians, sketchy and mostly unsigned statements extracted by Israeli jailers and military intelligence from the flotilla detainees before their release, and a book publication by one of the Turks on board the Mavi Marmara, the Turkel Report did not benefit from the input of the passengers and crew. Upon their release, former captives asserted that the statements and signatures were given under extreme physical and emotional duress, while the secretly filmed footage of their interrogations had been distorted by editing. The report alleged that due to the non-cooperation of other witnesses, it was compelled to rely mainly on testimonies and reports of Israeli parties. Amnesty reported that although the Commission invited flotilla participants to testify, it appeared to make only half-hearted attempts to secure their testimony. The report did not explain, however, why unsworn testimonies of Israeli commandos constituted credible evidence, whereas eyewitness testimonies of numerous passengers, accessible in the public domain, did not. On a cognate point, although the UN fact-finding mission failed to secure the cooperation of the Israeli government, It did make extensive use of the available public testimony before the Turkel Commission, whereas the Turkel Report made no effort to utilize the extensive eyewitness testimony collected by the International Fact-Finding Mission. The juxtaposition suggested two very different judicial temperaments at play, of which only one appeared to be seeking truth. Let us now examine the major points of contention between the UN Fact-Finding Mission and the Turkel Report. Which party initiated the violence? The UN Fact-Finding Mission concluded that as Israeli speedboats approached the Mavi Marmara, they were firing non-lethal weaponry onto the ship, including smoke and stun grenades, tear gas and paintballs, and possibly plastic bullets, and that, minutes after this initial Israeli assault was repelled by passengers, Israeli helicopters moved in, opening fire with live ammunition onto the top deck prior to the descent of the soldiers. The Turkel Report presented an altogether different picture. It did acknowledge that the Israeli rules of engagement allowed for use of force required to fulfill the mission, i.e., stopping the vessels, albeit it must be minimal and might be considered only as a last resort. It also acknowledged that operational orders allowed that, before the stage of taking control of the vessels, the force commander was permitted to employ various measures to stop the vessels, including firing skunk bombs, forcing the vessels to change their course or stop by means of firing warning shots into the air and white lighting, blinding, by using a large projector. At the very least, then, Israeli operational planning did not outright prohibit initiating force. But on the basis of closed-door testimony of the Chief of Staff, the report concluded that, in practice, no use was made of these measures. The report found that Israeli commandos in speedboats approached the Mavi Marmara peacefully and resorted to paintball guns and stun grenades only after they encountered resistance. Besides Israeli testimonies, the report cited video recordings. It is impossible sight unseen to evaluate the video evidence, although it can't but be wondered why Israel didn't make it available after release of the UN fact-finding mission's conclusions. If Israel had in its possession compelling evidence that refuted the UN mission, why would it keep this proof, the release of which couldn't pose a security threat, under wraps? The report recorded the precise times when passengers resorted to force against the commandos in speedboats. It did not, however, record the times when these commandos resorted to supposedly a retaliatory force. In a typical non sequitur, the report, attempting to refute suggestions that the IHH, Insani Yardim Vakfi, activists were acting in self-defense, stated, in seeking to capture and board the ship, the Israeli forces had to respond to the violence offered first by the IHH. This is evident from the magnetic media that shows the extreme levels of violence used against the IDF soldiers. But footage of passengers resorting to extreme levels of violence does not corroborate that they initiated the violence. The report also concluded that live ammunition was not fired from Israeli helicopters that subsequently moved in. It did acknowledge, however, that stun grenades were thrown down from the helicopters before the commandos hit the deck. It stated that the helicopters did not use live ammunition because the accurate use of firearms from a helicopter requires both specific equipment and specially trained personnel, with which the helicopters were not equipped. But if, on the one hand, the purpose of the firepower had been like the stun grenades to terrorize the passengers and clear the deck before the commandos rappelled on board, then precision marksmanship wasn't even required, while, on the other hand, it perplexes that trained marksmen were in short supply among Israel's elite fighting unit. The decision to intercept the flotilla in the dead of night appeared to belie the Turkel Report's sequencing of what unfolded. The report stated that if Israel launched its operation at 4:26 a.m., it was because, during such an operation, there is a great advantage to operating under the cover of darkness, quoting the Israeli Chief of Staff. But it isn't self-evident why a commando raid in the dead of night would be to Israel's advantage. The report repeatedly emphasized that, throughout the planning process, Israeli authorities at all levels anticipated that the participants in the flotilla were all peaceful civilians, and they seem not to have believed that the use of force would be necessary. They had expected the commandos to meet, at most, verbal resistance, pushing or punching, relatively minor civil disobedience, some pushing and limited physical contact. The report quoted the commandos themselves testifying, "We were expected to encounter activists who would try to hurt us emotionally by creating provocations on the level of curses, spitting, but we did not expect a difficult physical confrontation. We were expected to encounter peace activists, and therefore the prospect that we would have to use weapons or other means was nearly zero probability." But if it didn't expect forceful resistance, why didn't Israel launch the operation in broad daylight, indeed bringing along journalists who could vouch for its non-violent intentions? An operation launched in the blackness of night did make sense if Israel wanted to sow panic and confusion as a prelude to, and retrospectively to justify, a violent assault, as well as to obscure from potential witnesses its violent mode of attack. In the planning of such an operation, that is, an operation predicated on the use of violent force, there clearly was great advantage to operating under the cover of darkness. A premeditated decision to violently assault the Mavi Marmara would also account for the scope and nature of the planning. It would reconcile why Israel undertook intricate and ramified preparations that engaged the gamut of Israel's political, military, and intelligence apparatuses, including the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, the senior political security echelon, and persons with experience in these fields, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of Justice, IDF officers and public relations personnel. Why it decided that the command level would be very senior, including the commander of the Navy himself, why it imposed a communications blackout on the flotilla, and why it deployed the elite Special Forces Unit Shayatet 13, which was trained for lethal combat, instead of a routine police unit trained to quell civil resistance. The report stated that Special Forces trained teams are often used when a boarding is anticipated to be opposed, or non-compliant. But, surely, apprehending passengers predisposed to curses, spitting, didn't require deployment of Israel's elite fighting unit. It also stated that special forces were used because of the specialized training needed for fast roping onto the deck of a ship at night. However, that still leaves unanswered the question why the assault was launched at night. It might be wondered why Israel was at pains to emphasize that it didn't anticipate violent resistance. Couldn't it just as easily have alleged that although committed to a peaceful resolution of the crisis, it did expect violence, which was why the operation was launched before daybreak and so much military-like planning went into it? The reason, however, was not hard to find. If the commandos had been primed for a violent confrontation, then what ensued aboard the Mavi Marmara truly was, as Israeli pundits rued, a disgraceful fiasco and national humiliation. The only alibi Israel could fabricate to preserve the commandos' aura was that they were taken off guard by the violence. If the elite unit performed so poorly, it was because it hadn't prepared for armed resistance. Indeed, one of the Turkel Report's more comical aspects was the commandos' tales of daring do, plainly designed to restore the IDF's heroic image and boost national morale. Soldier number 1 recalled that 10 people jumped onto me and began brutally beating me from every direction, using clubs, metal rods, and fists. That a number of attackers grabbed me by my legs and my torso and threw me over the side to the deck below. That I fractured my arm, and a mob of dozens of people attacked me and basically lynched me, including pulling off my helmet, strangling me, sticking fingers into my eyes to gouge them out of their sockets, pulling my limbs in every direction, striking me in an extremely harsh manner with clubs and metal rods, mostly on my head. That I took an extremely harsh blow directly to my head from a metal rod. A lot of blood began streaming down my face from the wounds to my head. That after his capture by passengers, the only thing the ship's medic did was to wipe the blood from my forehead. Although he had a very deep scalp wound and a fractured skull, it later allegedly required 14 stitches, and that despite excruciating blows and gushing blood, fractured arm and fractured skull, he managed to break free of one of the guards. I jabbed my elbow into his ribs and jumped into the water. As soon as I reached the water, I dove underneath, so that they would not be able to hit me from the ship. I took off my shirt while diving and swimming, and I intended to swim and dive rapidly in a zigzag to escape from the enemy on the ship. A premeditated decision to violently assault the Mavi Marmara would also account for the scope and nature of the planning. It would reconcile why Israel undertook intricate and ramified preparations that engaged the gamut of Israel's political, military, and intelligence apparatuses, including the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, the senior political security echelon and persons with experience in these fields, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of Justice, IDF officers and public relations personnel. Wyatt decided that the command level would be very senior, including the commander of the Navy himself. Wyatt imposed a communications blackout on the flotilla, and Wyatt deployed the elite Special Forces Unit Shayatet 13, which was trained for lethal combat, instead of a routine police unit trained to quell civil resistance. The report stated that Special Forces trained teams are often used when a boarding is anticipated to be opposed, or non-compliant. But, surely, apprehending passengers predisposed to curses, spitting, didn't require deployment of Israel's elite fighting unit. It also stated that special forces were used because of the specialized training needed for fast roping onto the deck of a ship at night. However, that still leaves unanswered the question why the assault was launched at night. Is it ungenerous to wonder whether these commandos had watched a few too many Rambo flicks? Is it ungenerous to wonder whether these commandos had watched a few too many Rambo flicks? Did Islamic activists plot and arm themselves to murder Israelis? The Turkel Report found that passengers aboard the Mavi Marmara, the hardcore group of which comprised about 40 IHH activists, had plotted before embarkation to resist with force, even to commit murder, and had sought out martyrdom. I have no doubt, an Israeli commander of the operation testified, that the terrorists on the vessel planned, organized, foresaw the events, and planned to kill a soldier. It is evident, the report concluded, that the IHH organized and planned for a violent confrontation with the Israeli military forces. The IHH had a pre-existing plan to violently oppose the Israeli boarding, and a number of IHH activists took part in hostilities from a planning and logistical perspective, well before the arrival of the Israeli armed forces. The report alleged that as against the overwhelming majority of relatively moderate passengers, IHH activists boarded the Mavi Marmara separately and without any security checks, and thus were able to smuggle on an arsenal of weapons to execute their murderous plot. Contrariwise, and for what it's worth, the Turkish government protested that not just once but twice, all crew members and passengers were subjected to stringent X-ray checks as well as customs and passport controls. All personal belongings and cargo were also thoroughly inspected and cleared. Cargo contained no arms, munitions, or other material that would constitute a threat. The report's inventory of the combat equipment apparently brought on board by the flotilla participants included 150 protective ceramic vests, 300 gas masks, communication devices, optical devices, several night vision goggles, and a few binoculars, slingshots of various kinds, 200 knives, 20 axes, thousands of ball bearings and stones, disc saws, pepper sprays, and smoke flares. This cache of combat equipment, concentration of weaponry, extensive equipment which was brought on board, appeared in a somewhat less sinister light when juxtaposed with the report's itemization that kitchens and the cafeterias on the ship contained a total of about 200 knives, and the ship's fire-extinguishing equipment included about 20 axes. It flabbergasts that the obvious correlations escaped, or did they, the Commission's notice. The report did not find that the evidence points conclusively to the fact that the IHH activists brought firearms aboard the Mavi Marmara. But if they plotted a violent confrontation with one of the world's most formidable military powers, and if they could freely carry on board the weapons of their choosing, it perplexes why the most lethal implements they thought to bring along were slingshots and glass marbles. Truly, these shaheeds were mashuga. The report noted that just before the Israeli operation began, the Islamic extremists improvised weapons, such as iron rods and wooden clubs. The Commission apparently never pondered the obvious question: if they were hell-bent on committing bloody murder, well before the arrival of the Israeli armed forces, why didn't the Islamists bring on board firearms, and why did they wait until the last minute before producing makeshift weapons? The UN fact-finding mission found no evidence that any of the passengers used firearms at any stage. But whereas the Turkel Report found no proof that the passengers brought along firearms, it still concluded that members of the IHH activists used firearms against Israeli forces, which they presumably seized from the commandos before wounding 2 of them. The report stated that it consulted medical documents regarding the injuries to the soldiers. But it did not cite hospital records documenting the commandos' alleged bullet wounds. Instead, it cited a statement submitted by the IDF and the oral testimony of the Chief of Staff. In the case of non-bullet wounds incurred by the commandos, the report did cite hospital records. Since the report failed to cite hospital records attesting to the alleged bullet wounds, it is doubtful they existed, but even if they did, they could just as easily have been inflicted by other Israeli commandos. The report itself acknowledged that the melee on board the Mavi Marmara, especially during the initial stages on the roof, was a situation of considerable confusion. In fact, one of the commandos allegedly hit by a bullet initially thought his wound resulted from the Israeli forces. The report enumerated 3 grounds for its conclusion that passengers used firearms: physical evidence of gunshot wounds, which didn't speak to the point of origin of the gunshots, statements of numerous soldiers, which were as credible as their Rambo fantasies, and the fact that IHH activists had access to captured IDF weapons, which proved nothing. Still, why would the report conclude on the basis of such flimsy evidence that passengers used firearms against the commandos? The report itself provided the answer. While it contended that the commandos' resort to lethal force would have been justified even if the passengers did not shoot at them, the report went on to say that the use of firearms by IHH activists is an important factor because it significantly heightened the risk posed to the soldiers and their perception of that risk, and establishing the level of threat that the Israeli soldiers believed they were facing is a factor in the assessment as to whether their response was proportionate. If the report wanted to definitively conclude that the commandos' resort to lethal force was legally justifiable, it had to find evidence that the passengers used firearms against them. The predetermined exoneration dictated the evidentiary finding. The Turkel Report quoted the harrowing accounts by the captured commandos of the Islamists' murderous ambitions. Soldier number 1 testified that the terrorist group wanted to attack me and kill me. Soldier number 3 testified that they were crazed and very eager to kill us. They tried to strangle me and soldier number 4. The hate in their eyes was just burning. This attempt to strangle me was made several times. The report also highlighted that the cadre of Islamic killers were very large and strong men, approximately ages 20 to 40, very big and heavy, and that some of those activists also expressed their wish to be shaheeds. The obvious question was, why didn't this mob of burly homicidal shaheeds manage to kill any of the captured commandos? Quoting the commandos, the report's unfazed response was that the peaceniks on board, older men and women who showed restraint, non-violent peace activists, came to the commandos' rescue. The terrorist group wanted to attack me and kill me, while the moderate group tried to protect me. There were two groups there, the one which tried to kill us and the ones who prevented the extreme group from killing us. In other words, the crazed jihadists were stopped dead in their tracks by Grannies for Peace and the Birkenstock Brigade. Did the Israeli commandos use lethal force only as a last resort? The conduct of the Israeli military and other personnel towards the flotilla passengers was not only disproportionate to the occasion, the UN fact-finding mission concluded, but demonstrated levels of totally unnecessary and incredible violence. It betrayed an unacceptable level of brutality. The Turkel Report concluded that, on the contrary, the commandos exercised maximum restraint and used lethal force only as a last resort. It stated that during Israeli preparations for the interception, special attention was paid to the value of human life, and all of the persons involved evinced a high level of awareness of the need to carry out the operation without any injuries to the participants of the flotilla, that either the rules of engagement or operational orders, or both of them, stipulated that if force had to be used, it had to be exercised gradually and in proportion to the resistance met, and only after examining alternatives to prevent deterioration of the situation. The only case in which use of lethal weapons was permitted was in self-defense, to remove a real and imminent danger to life. When the danger cannot be removed by less harmful means, there should be no use of force at a person who has surrendered or has ceased to constitute a threat. That the training and preparation of the soldiers leading up to the operation was very thorough, with a particular emphasis on the use of less lethal weapons. The default position was to use less lethal weapons until an opposing threat forced the use of the lethal options. That it was stated at an operational briefing, opening fire should only take place in a life-threatening situation, to neutralize the person presenting the danger, but nonetheless, where possible, the benefit of doubt should be given. That even after shooting could be heard on the Mavi Marmara, the Shayatet 13 commander refused to give approval for shooting, in order to prevent deaths among the participants of the flotilla, and that the IDF soldiers made considerable use of graduated force, that is, firing at the legs and feet of a person, during the operation, with soldiers switching repeatedly between less lethal and lethal weapons, even after passengers had allegedly used firearms against them. The Israeli commandos were so solicitous of the passengers' well-being, according to the report, that following the bloody confrontation, some IDF wounded only received treatment after the treatment of wounded flotilla participants. The commander of the takeover force testified that he risked danger to my people aboard the vessel in order to evacuate the wounded passengers from the vessel, despite their lack of desire to be evacuated, in order to save their lives. The report concluded that the IDF personnel acted professionally in the face of extensive and unanticipated violence, and did not overreact. The manner of death of the 9 passengers aboard the Mavi Marmara appeared to belie the Turkel Report's rendition. The UN fact-finding mission found that the circumstances of the killing of at least 6 of the passengers were in a manner consistent with an extralegal, arbitrary and summary execution. The report itself recounted the findings of an external examination by Israeli doctors, according to which all of the dead passengers suffered multiple bullet wounds and 5 were shot in the neck or head. For example, quoting the Israeli examination, body number 2 contained bullet wounds on the right side of the head, on the right side of the back of the neck, on the right cheek, underneath the chin, on the right side of the back, on the thigh. A bullet was palpated on the left side of the chest, while body number 9 contained bullet wounds in the area of the right temple/back of the neck, bullet wound in the left nipple, bullet wound in the area of the scalp forehead on the left side, bullet wound on the face, nose, bullet wound on the left torso, bullet wound on the right side of the back, 2 bullet wounds in the left thigh, 2 bullet wounds as a result of the bullet passing through toes 4 and 5 on the left foot. The report did not attempt to square the gruesome facts of these passengers' deaths with its sublime finding that the commandos exercised maximum restraint. The closest it came was brief mention in another context, and not referring specifically to the dead passengers, that, in some instances, numerous rounds were fired either by one soldier or by more than one soldier to stop an IHH activist, who was a threat to the lives of themselves or other soldiers. What's more, the report was curiously uncurious about the passengers' deaths, which were blandly dispatched in just 2 of the report's nearly 300 pages. The report cited the chilling testimony of Israeli commandos on every scratch they incurred, yet it expended not a single word on how it came to pass that, despite taking every possible precaution and exercising every conceivable restraint, the commandos ended up killing 9 passengers, shooting nearly all of them multiple times. Perhaps the Commission forgot to request specific information on their deaths, or the commandos forgot to mention the killings in their statements. Neither possibility speaks very highly to the report's credibility. The report stated that the Commission has examined each instance of the use of force reported by the IDF soldiers in their testimonies. But it didn't bother to mention whether any of these testimonies recounted the killings of the 9 passengers. It also stated that the Commission examined 133 incidents in which force was used, which were described by over 40 soldiers, and also includes a few incidents that were depicted on the available relevant magnetic media, and that did not correspond to the soldiers' testimonies. But it didn't bother to mention whether the magnetic media captured the killings of any of the passengers. In addition, whereas the UN fact-finding mission requested the Turkish autopsy reports, the Turkel Commission apparently did not. The bottom line was that although the killings of the 9 passengers aboard the Mavi Marmara sparked an international outcry, the report contained not a single syllable on how any of them died. The nearest it came was a vague allusion buried in a footnote, quoting a commando that he fired 2 to 3 rounds to the center of mass and below and 1 round to the head. The soldier testified that after firing the last round the IHH personnel, fell and he ceased fire. The report was so intent on demonizing the dead passengers, yet so unconcerned with how they came to die, that it took no notice of an odd paradox lodged in its conclusions. The Shaheeds plotted and armed themselves to kill Israelis, but didn't manage to kill even those in their custody, whereas the Israelis took every precaution and exercised every restraint not to kill anyone, but ended up killing 9 people. Lest it be thought that Israel was wholly unmoved by the passengers' ordeal, the report did duly record that a military court sentenced a corporal to 5 months in prison for stealing a laptop computer, 2 camera lenses, and a compass. In the preface to the report, the members of the Turkel Commission, including a former Supreme Court Justice, a former Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a former president of a distinguished scientific institute, a respected professor of law, and a foreign observer who won the Nobel Peace Prize, stated that, "We took upon ourselves jointly and as individuals the difficult and agonizing task of ascertaining the truth." The U.S. Department of State praised the investigation that culminated in the report as credible and impartial and transparent, and the document itself as independent. Regrettably, neither the factual information nor the legal analysis in the report cast light on what happened on the fateful night of May 31, 2010. The sole reflection stimulated by the report was, how could any self-respecting individual have signed off on such rubbish? But beyond this sordid spectacle of moral degradation looms, albeit inversely, an inspiring testament to the majesty of austere truth. "Oh, what a tangled web we weave," Walter Scott observed, "when first we practice to deceive." If the Turkel Commission tied itself in 1,000 mortifying knots, that's because it set out not to find truth, but to vindicate Israel, whatever the cost. Chapter 9. Whitewash 2. The UN Panel Report. Israel's deadly assault on the Mavi Marmara refused to go away. Turkey wouldn't relent in its demand for accountability, and as a state of some standing in the international community, it appeared better poised than Gaza to gain satisfaction. The President of the UN Security Council issued a statement on June 1, 2010, the day after the incident, calling for a prompt, impartial, credible and transparent investigation, conforming to international standards. It was initially a standoff, as Israel opposed an international investigation, no doubt because a truly independent inquiry would perforce reach the damning conclusions of the UN Human Rights Council fact-finding mission. But Ban Ki-moon, ever attuned to the signals emanating from the White House, came to Israel's rescue. He negotiated the creation of a panel of inquiry, hereafter, UN panel, with an eviscerated mandate. It was tasked not to conduct an impartial, credible and transparent investigation, but merely to review reports of national investigations into the incident. Leaving nothing to fortune, Ban appointed singularly corrupt and criminal Colombian ex-president Álvaro Uribe, who was also an outspoken proponent of closer military ties between Colombia and Israel, as vice-chair of the panel. A former Prime Minister of New Zealand was designated the chair. Israel then reversed itself, acquiescing in the Secretary-General's proposal as it proclaimed that it had nothing to hide. It was predictable, and predicted at the time, that the panel would produce a whitewash. Still, Israeli opposition leader Tzipi Livni deplored the creation of a UN panel because international intervention in military operations carried out by Israel is unacceptable. Israel is investigating the events of the flotilla itself, and that is enough. Indeed, who could doubt that Israel's killing of foreign nationals in international waters was an internal Israeli affair? The report of the Secretary-General's panel of inquiry on the May 31, 2010 flotilla incident was released in July 2011. Basing itself on Israel's Turkel Report and a reciprocal national report submitted by Turkey, the UN panel set forth the facts, circumstances, and context of the incident, and recommended ways of avoiding similar incidents in the future. Although it did find that Israel's killing of the 9 passengers aboard the Mavi Marmara could not be justified, the panel vindicated Israel's central contention that the naval blockade of Gaza was legal. If the people of Gaza had not suffered enough, the Secretary-General now lent the UN's imprimatur to the prime instrument of their ongoing torture. The report itself was probably the most mendacious and debased document ever issued under the UN's aegis. The UN panel alleged that Israel had a right to impose a naval blockade on Gaza in order to defend itself against Hamas rocket and mortar attacks. The historical background sketched in by the panel was as skewed as that presented by Israel's own inquiry. Israel has faced and continues to face a real threat to its security from militant groups in Gaza, the panel observed. Rockets, missiles, and mortar bombs have been launched from Gaza towards Israel. Since 2001, such attacks have caused more than 25 deaths and hundreds of injuries. The panel devoted not a single syllable to Israeli attacks on Gaza. Since 2001, or during the same period, Israeli assaults killed some 4,500 Gazans, overwhelmingly civilians. According to the panel, the purpose of these, Hamas, acts of violence, which have been repeatedly condemned by the international community, has been to do damage to the population of Israel. But a study published in the Journal of the National Academy of Sciences found that Palestinian violence directed at Israel reveals a pattern of retaliation. If the panel couldn't conceive that Palestinian violence might be reactive, that's because, by its reckoning, the initial Israeli assaults didn't happen, only Gazans fired rockets, missiles. The panel was apparently unaware that Israel's attacks on Gaza also have been repeatedly condemned by the international community. The panel stated that it seems obvious enough that stopping these violent, Hamas acts was a necessary step for Israel to take in order to protect its people and to defend itself. If the panel had noticed Palestinian deaths, it would perhaps also have been obvious enough that Hamas had a right to impose a naval blockade on Israel, in order to protect its people and to defend itself. Amnesty International pointed out that it is illegal under international law to transfer weapons to a consistent violator of human rights and that, accordingly, an immediate, comprehensive arms embargo should be imposed on both Hamas and Israel. If the panel ignored this obvious enough fact, it's maybe because Vice Chair Uribe, in one of his periodic rants against human rights organizations, denounced the blindness and fanaticism of Amnesty. The UN panel found that the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza constituted a legitimate security measure, and its implementation complied with the requirements of international law. But the panel also repeatedly stressed that it was not asked to make determinations of the legal issues, and was not asked to determine the legality or otherwise of the events. If it nonetheless made such a legal determination, it could only have been to gratuitously validate Israel's throttling of Gaza. The panel stated that it will not add value for the United Nations by arguing endlessly about the applicable law. Yet, it devoted the vast preponderance of its report, including a 25-page appendix, to a legal analysis of the blockade that vindicated Israel. The panel's exoneration of Israel was the sole legal verdict it delivered in the report. It found that Israel's land blockade of Gaza and its killing of 9 passengers aboard the Mavi Marmara were both unacceptable. But it did not determine that these constituted illegal, let alone criminal, acts. The panel stated that it couldn't render definitive findings of fact or law, because it couldn't compel witnesses to provide evidence, and couldn't conduct criminal investigations. However, it went on to state that it can give its view. But if it could give its view of the legality of the naval blockade absent these judicial powers, it could surely also have rendered an opinion on the legality of the land blockade and the killings of the 9 passengers. In other words, the one and only potentially consequential verdict the panel reached was favorable to Israel, whereas its unfavorable judgments of Israel amounted to little more than rhetorical slaps on the wrist. In contrast, Amnesty deemed the Israeli blockade a flagrant violation of international law, while the UN Human Rights Council's fact-finding mission on the Flotilla assault found that the circumstances of the killing of at least 6 of the passengers were in a manner consistent with an extralegal, arbitrary, and summary execution. The panel also undid the law when it suited Israel's purposes. Thus, it referred to the uncertain legal status of Gaza under international law, although the legal consensus was that even after Israel's 2005 disengagement, Gaza remained occupied territory. The argument contrived by the UN panel to justify the Israeli naval blockade comprised a sequence of interrelated propositions. 1. The Israeli naval blockade of Gaza was unrelated to the Israeli land blockade. 2. Israel confronted a novel security threat from Gaza's coastal waters when it imposed the naval blockade. 3. Israel imposed the naval blockade in response to this security threat. 4. The naval blockade was the only means Israel had at its disposal to meet this security threat, and 5. The Israeli naval blockade achieved its security objective without causing disproportionate harm to Gaza's civilian population. To pronounce the naval blockade legal, the panel had to sustain each and every one of these propositions. If even one were false, its defense of the blockade collapsed. The astonishing thing was, they were all false. Each proposition will be addressed in turn. Spurious proposition number 1, the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza was unrelated to the Israeli land blockade. The dual objective of Israel's blockade was to prevent weapons from reaching Gaza and to destabilize the Hamas regime by blocking passage of vital civilian goods. The land and naval prongs of the blockade constituted, in conception as well as execution, complementary halves of Israel's strategy, while the efficacy of each prong depended on the efficacy of the other. But the critical premise of the UN panel was that the Israeli naval blockade was distinct from the land blockade. It posited that whereas the land blockade subserved the dual objective, the naval blockade was a mere security measure and therefore legal. The panel contrived this bifurcation. It had no basis in reality. Indeed, the Israeli government itself denied such a distinction. The panel invented it in order to avoid passing legal judgment on Israel's collective punishment of Gaza's civilian population. It set as its mandate to assess only the legality of the allegedly separate and distinct naval blockade. But the panel simultaneously upheld Israel's right to inflict such collective punishment, by purporting that Israel was acting in self-defense against arms smuggling when it blocked the flotillas. Since the inception of its occupation in 1967, Israel had regulated passage of goods and persons along Gaza's land and coastal borders. After Hamas consolidated its control of Gaza in 2007, Israel imposed a yet more stringent blockade on it. The motive behind the blockade was twofold: a security objective of preventing weapons from reaching Gaza, and a political objective of bringing Gaza's economy to the brink of collapse, as Israeli officials repeatedly put it in private, in order to punish Gazans for electing Hamas and to turn them against it. The list of items Israel barred from entering Gaza, such as chocolate, chips, and chicks, pointed up the irreducibly political aspect of the blockade. The UN panel, citing Israel's Turkel Report, did acknowledge that the Israeli blockade was designed to weaken the economy of Gaza. But it then immediately qualified, in order to undermine Hamas's ability to attack Israel. One could only shiver at the potency of Hamas's military arsenal if Israel had allowed bonbons to enter Gaza. In fact, although Israel's Turkel Report vindicated Israel on all key points regarding the flotilla assault, even it had to concede, albeit circumspectly, the dual objective of the naval blockade. Consider the testimony it cited by Tzipi Livni, who was foreign minister when the naval blockade was imposed, and the document it cited by Major General, Res. Amos Gilad, head of the Political, Military, and Policy Affairs Bureau at the Ministry of Defense, which delineated the purposes of the blockade. Tzipi Livni said that the imposition of the naval blockade was done in a wider context, as part of Israel's comprehensive strategy, which she referred to as a dual strategy, of delegitimizing Hamas, on the one hand, and strengthening the status of the Palestinian Authority vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip, on the other. According to her approach, the attempts to transfer humanitarian goods to the Gaza Strip by sea give legitimacy to the Hamas regime in the Gaza Strip. Livni also stated that it would be a mistake to examine the circumstances of imposing the naval blockade from a narrow security perspective only. The document, by Gilad, contains two considerations behind the blockade: one is to prevent any military strengthening of the Hamas, the other is to isolate and weaken Hamas. In this context, Major General, Res. Gilad stated that the significance of opening a maritime route to the Gaza Strip was that the Hamas's status would be strengthened significantly, from economic and political viewpoints. He further stated that opening a maritime route to the Gaza Strip, particularly while it is under Hamas control, would be tantamount of a very significant achievement for Hamas. Major General, Res. Gilad concluded, in summary, the need to impose a naval blockade on the Gaza Strip arises from security and military considerations, and also to prevent any legitimization and economic and political strengthening of Hamas, and strengthening it in the internal Palestinian arena, vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It would therefore appear, the Turkel Report concluded, that even though the purpose of the naval blockade was fundamentally a security one in response to military needs, its imposition was also regarded by the decision-makers as legitimate within the concept of Israel's comprehensive, dual strategy against the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The Turkel Report also did not dispute that the naval blockade was integral to the global strategy of achieving the twin objectives. On the contrary, it was emphatic that the land and sea blockade must be treated as a seamless whole. Both the naval blockade and the land crossings policy were imposed and implemented because of the prolonged international armed conflict between Israel and the Hamas. And the strategic level. The naval blockade is regarded by the government as part of Israel's wider effort not to give legitimacy to the Hamas's rule over the Gaza Strip, to isolate it in the international arena, and to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. The Turkel Report further pointed out that the naval blockade is also connected to the land crossings policy on a tactical level. Whenever cargo aboard vessels headed for Gaza was rerouted through the land crossings, it was subject to the land restrictions barring the passage of critical goods such as iron and cement. It continued, in other words, as long as the land crossings are subject to Israeli control, there is prima facie a possibility that the opening of an additional route to the Gaza Strip, such as a maritime route that is not controlled by the State of Israel, will affect the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Put simply, if the flotillas pried open a sea route to Gaza, essential civilian goods currently blocked by Israel at the land crossings could reach it. Therefore, the Turkel Report concluded, it is possible that the enforcement of the naval blockade, in addition to the implementation of the land crossings policy, has a humanitarian impact on the population. At least in principle, the approach of the Israeli government created a connection regarding the humanitarian effect on the Gaza Strip between the naval blockade and the land crossings policy. The long and short of it was that even the Turkel Report, which Israel submitted to the panel and to which the panel otherwise reflexively deferred, depicted the naval blockade as no less critical than the land blockade to achieving Israel's political objective of bringing Gaza's economy to the brink of collapse. If the Turkel Report held that the land and naval blockades both, in principle, and as a tactical, practical matter constituted a single, unified whole, it could defend the propriety of the Israeli naval blockade only by simultaneously defending the propriety of the land blockade, and treating each in conjunction with the other, to separate them out. To pretend that the naval blockade differed in kind from the land blockade would have been an exercise in casuistry. Given the Turkel Commission's approach that regarded the naval blockade and the land restrictions as interlinked, a pair of Israeli scholars observed, it could only justify the former by defending the legality of the latter. In the event, the Turkel Report found, if only by tortuous reasoning and factual elision, that the unified land-naval blockade passed legal muster. The UN panel was consequently confronted with a dilemma. If it retraced the Turkel Report's line of argument, it would have to pass judgment on Israel's blockade policy as a whole. But if it passed such a comprehensive judgment, the panel could vindicate Israel only by blatantly contradicting near-unanimous legal opinion, which declared the Israeli blockade of Gaza a form of collective punishment in flagrant violation of international law. To meet the challenge of upholding the legality of the siege while not offending international opinion, the panel resolved on an altogether singular strategy. It artificially pried the land blockade from the naval blockade, relegated the land blockade to a secondary and side issue, and proceeded to home in on the naval blockade as if it were a thing apart. It cannot be overstressed just how radical a surgical procedure the panel performed. For all its apologetic, not even the Turkel Report conceived such a divorce. In his dissenting letter appended to the panel's final report, the Turkish representative justly took the panel to task because it fully associated itself with Israel's legal analysis justifying the blockade, whereas the Turkish report's assessment that the blockade was illegal found support among the vast majority of the international community. He missed, however, the most telling point. In order to vindicate Israel, the panel ventured on a bizarre legal terrain that was alien even to Israel's own Turkel Report. Once embarked on this path, the panel did not even recoil at flagrant distortion. It stated that several international organizations and institutions, including the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, have declared that the land restrictions constitute collective punishments. However, these organizations declared not just the land restrictions, but the whole of Israel's border policy, the land and naval blockade, illegal. It was the panel that cooked up the idea that the naval blockade existed apart from and independent of the land restrictions. Indeed, the Turkel Report itself acknowledged that various human rights and humanitarian organizations conclude that the collapse of the economy of the Gaza Strip derives from the naval blockade imposed by Israel and its land crossings policy. If the Gazan economy was imploding, it was not due just to land restrictions. The UN panel purported that the Israeli land blockade and naval blockade constituted two distinct concepts which require different treatment and analysis. It, therefore, treated the naval blockade as separate and distinct from the controls at the land crossings, which are not directly related to the naval blockade. In order to sustain this anomalous contention, the panel pointed to the facts that, chronologically, imposition of the land blockade, in 2007, preceded imposition of the naval blockade, in 2009, that the intensity of the land blockade fluctuated over time whereas the naval blockade has not been altered since its imposition, and that the naval blockade was imposed primarily to enable Israel to exert control over ships attempting to reach Gaza with weapons and related goods. This series of affirmations confused and conflated the strategic objectives of the Israeli blockade with the tactical modalities of its enforcement. Although Israel periodically adjusted its siege policies to accommodate new political contingencies, the dual security political objective stayed constant. The premise effectively underpinning the panel's legal analysis, that as against the security and political functions of the land blockade, the purpose of the coastal blockade was exclusively to prevent weapons from reaching Gaza, did not just contradict Israel's own testimony. It also overstepped the panel's terms of reference. The panel was mandated only to review the Israeli and Turkish national reports. But neither of these reports disputed the dual objective of the unified land naval blockade, neither alleged that the naval blockade differed in kind from the land blockade, neither alleged that the naval blockade was designed only to interdict weapons. The panel conjured a distinction to resolve a non-existent controversy. The bottom line was that the panel sought to sidestep the legality of laying an economic siege to a civilian population, to avoid rendering judgment on whether Israel was legally within its right to block the passage of essential civilian goods, as well as chocolate, chips, and chicks. If the panel upheld the legality of such a siege, it risked provoking an outcry from the human rights community, but if it declared the blockade illegal, it infringed on Israel's inalienable right to torment Gaza, that it couldn't do. It extricated itself from this impasse by artificially splitting the land from the naval blockade and focusing exclusively on the naval blockade, while pretending that the naval blockade did not interdict civilian goods, only weapons. To be sure, a legal assessment of, respectively, the land and naval blockades did require a differentiated analysis because the relevant bodies of law do not fully overlap. But until the panel came along, it was never suggested, not even by Israel's Turkel Report, that the broad purposes of the naval blockade fundamentally differed from those of the land blockade. Only the panel dared to purport that the naval blockade had no political dimension, that it didn't crucially figure in Israel's strategy of destabilizing Hamas by punishing Gaza's civilian population. The ultimate irony was that, sensu stricto, the naval blockade did serve only one of the two purposes, but it was not the military one. Its purpose was narrowly political. The panel was thus doubly wrong. The naval blockade was not distinct from the land blockade, and the purpose of the naval blockade was not primarily security. Spurious proposition number 2. Israel confronted a novel security threat from Gaza's coastal waters when it imposed the naval blockade. The fundamental principle of the freedom of navigation on the high seas, the UN panel observed, is subject to only certain limited exceptions under international law. A state attempting to restrict this freedom accordingly bears a heavy legal burden of justification. It follows from these tenets that the greater the impediment a state places on freedom of navigation, the greater the legal onus it must bear. If a fundamental freedom is at stake, then infringements on it must be graduated. An extreme restriction would not be justified if a lesser restriction would intercept the perceived threat. In the instant case, if the visit and search of a vessel, where reasonable grounds existed for suspicion, was an effective means of preventing contraband from reaching Gaza, then it couldn't be justified to impose the more stringent measure of a naval blockade that indiscriminately barred the passage of all goods, military and non-military, and consequently inflicted harm on the civilian population. For argument's sake, it will be set aside that not just the blockade but also Israel's visit and search procedure was illegal. The UN panel purported that Israel confronted a novel security threat from Gaza's coastal waters that could be met only by a naval blockade. However, the evidence it adduced in support of this contention underwhelmed. It cited, on the basis of the Turkel Report, 3 alleged instances of attempted weapons smuggling into Gaza from the sea, the last of which, in 2003, had occurred 6 years before Israel's imposition of the naval blockade. It further alleged, citing the Turkel Report, that after its 2005 Gaza disengagement, Israel had to establish a new legal basis if it still sought to prevent weapons from reaching Gaza. Even if this were true, it still wouldn't explain why the visit and search procedure proved effective from 2005 until mid-2008 when, according to the panel, echoing the Turkel Report, its implementation abruptly posed practical difficulties. It was not as if, nor did the Turkel Report allege that, Israel was suddenly overwhelmed by a large number of weapons smuggling operations, such that visit and search had become too cumbersome a procedure. The panel, citing the Turkel Report, also alleged that only a naval blockade provided a legal basis for preventing Hamas from smuggling weapons out of Gaza to launch attacks on Israel from the sea. However, the panel cited no instances, none apparently existed, of Hamas attempting such a maneuver. It did cite Israeli concerns that Hamas might attempt such a maneuver in the unbounded future. But insofar as it had not been attempted in the past, and insofar as Israel apparently did not harbor any such fear before 2009, otherwise it would have imposed the naval blockade earlier, and insofar as Israel cited no evidentiary basis for its claim that such a maneuver might be attempted by Hamas at some point in the nebulous future, insofar, then, as Israel did not materially ground this alleged fear, it was a palpably flimsy justification for so restrictive a curb on freedom of navigation. The upshot was that the panel adduced zero evidence that Israel confronted a novel security threat from Gaza's coastal waters, when it escalated its infringement on the freedom of navigation principle by imposing an indiscriminate naval blockade. Spurious Proposition Number 3, Israel imposed the naval blockade in response to this security threat. The UN panel alleged, on the basis of the Turkel Report, that Israel imposed the naval blockade in order to prevent weapons, terrorists, and money from entering or exiting the Gaza Strip by sea. But although Israel formally gestured to this threat, the panel did not present a persuasive case for crediting this official Israeli testimony. In its legal analysis of the naval blockade, the panel's point of departure was, if Israel says so, it must be true. The Israeli report to the panel makes it clear that the naval blockade was adopted for the purpose of defending its territory and population, and the panel accepts that was the case. It is evident that Israel had a military objective. The stated primary objective of the naval blockade was for security. It was to prevent weapons, ammunition, military supplies, and people from entering Gaza and to stop Hamas operatives sailing away from Gaza with vessels filled with explosives. Still, the perplexity remains, if it wasn't to prevent weapons smuggling, Why did Israel impose the naval blockade? In fact, the explanation was right there in the Turkel Report. Beginning in mid-2008, the Turkel Report observed, various flotillas whose stated destination was the Gaza Strip were organized. In view of the fact that the ships concerned were neutral, the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, had relatively limited options, which mainly included the power of visit and search, a power that can be used, inter alia, on condition that there are reasonable grounds for suspecting that a ship is subject to capture, that is, that it was carrying contraband. The quandary confronting Israel, however, was that the flotillas did not carry weapons, hence, it lacked a legal basis for blocking their passage into Gaza. Initially, Israel let a succession of vessels pass without even bothering to search them, in the hope that the flotilla phenomenon would peter out. Between August and December 2008, Israel let 6 vessels pass into Gaza. When the ships kept coming, Israel responded with escalating violence, but still, they kept coming. It was, in these circumstances, on January 3, 2009, the Turkel Report continued, that the Minister of Defense ordered a naval blockade. The significance of imposing a naval blockade according to the rules of international law is that it allows a party to an armed conflict to prevent entry into the prohibited area of any vessel that attempts to breach the blockade, even without it being established that the vessel is assisting terrorist activity. In testimony quoted by the Turkel Report, which the panel once again prudently overlooked, Israel's military advocate general stated that the naval blockade was imposed specifically in order to prevent the humanitarian flotillas from reaching Gaza. The military advocate general testified before the commission that the IDF was compelled to find a suitable operational solution for the maritime zone in view of the increase in the phenomenon of flotillas. A naval blockade was regarded as the best operational method of dealing with the phenomenon because other solutions, such as the use of the right of visit and search, were proved to be problematic and other sources of authority were regarded as weaker. He military advocate general apprised the Chief of Staff that he had spoken with the Attorney General, who also expressed the position that the declaration of a naval blockade on the Gaza Strip gave the optimal legal operational solution to preventing the entry of foreign shipping vessels into the Gaza Strip, and gave the Navy all of the tools and powers required to prevent the passage of shipping vessels. The sources of authority that allow action to be taken against shipping vessels, in the absence of a declaration of a naval blockade, are weaker, and their practicability is doubtful. On December 30, 2008, the military advocate general once again contacted the Chief of Staff and said that in the early hours of the morning the Navy forces were required to contend with the yacht Dignity, one of the earlier humanitarian ships that left Cyprus for the Gaza Strip, and that the incident highlighted the legal difficulty of dealing with foreign civilian shipping vessels trying to reach the coast of the Gaza Strip. He once again asked the Chief of Staff to bring his recommendation of a naval blockade before the political echelon. On January 3, 2009, after the security establishment's legal advisor gave his opinion on the subject, the Minister of Defense signed an order to impose the blockade. It was evidently not the type of vessel, civilian commercial versus military naval, that posed a complication for Israel. It already possessed the legal authority under visit and search to stop a civilian vessel and prevent passage of weapons, and the procedure had proven practicable. Indeed, Israel neither bothered to search humanitarian vessels headed for Gaza. It was presumably privy to the fact that they weren't stashing weapons, nor did it suddenly have to cope with a rash of arms smuggling. Further, if weapons were to be smuggled in, they almost certainly would be secreted in a civilian commercial vessel. The advent of the flotillas, then, did not alter the legal situation, before as well as after. Israel's principal legal preoccupation, officially, must have been civilian ships. The actual challenge facing Israel was that it lacked legal authority to bar humanitarian cargo unless it imposed a naval blockade. In the panel's disingenuously opaque language, the blockade was imposed not because of weapons smuggling but, in reaction to certain incidents when vessels had reached Gaza via sea. The certain incidents gestured to the determination of the flotilla passengers, come what may, to deliver essential humanitarian goods to Gaza's besieged population. What Israel dreaded was not arms transfers but the political defeat it would suffer if a maritime route were opened, allowing humanitarian vessels to reach Gaza, and that in the course of opening such a route, these flotillas would spotlight Israel's illegal, immoral, and inhuman siege. The irony was that the panel falsely separated out the land from the naval blockade in order to justify the naval blockade on security grounds, whereas even senior Israeli officials conceded that the naval blockade was imposed to meet, not a security threat but the increase in the phenomenon of flotillas, the entry of foreign civilian vessels. Indeed, it was because Israel did not confront a security threat that it replaced visit and search with a naval blockade. If it had stuck to the former procedure, it could legally seize only contraband but would otherwise have to let vessels pass, while if it imposed a naval blockade, it could legally interdict strictly humanitarian vessels from reaching Gaza. But, it might be argued, if a succession of humanitarian flotillas opened a maritime route to Gaza, wouldn't it eventually create a security threat to Israel, as vessels smuggling weapons could pass? Even if such a contingency were real, however, it still remained that the blockade was not imposed because of an actual security threat to Israel. It would be difficult to justify so restrictive a curb on the fundamental right to freedom of navigation, on the basis of a threat that might, but also might not, materialize in a nebulous future. The imposition of a draconian blockade on the basis of a speculative future contingency would be yet more difficult to justify, in the face of the humanitarian harm it entailed in the here and now. Spurious proposition number 4. The naval blockade was the only means Israel had at its disposal to meet this security threat. The purpose of the naval blockade was not to meet a security threat but to preempt the political fallout, if the siege of Hamas-controlled Gaza were breached. Even if, for argument's sake, the claim were credited that, as a practical matter and setting aside the law, no country at war would permit a convoy of ships, even a declared humanitarian convoy that had been vetted beforehand, to pass freely into enemy territory under its control, Israel still had at its disposal another option. The UN panel itself alluded to it, if only in passing and in another context. At a briefing immediately after the May 31, 2010 incident, the panel reported, a senior United Nations official noted that the loss of life could have been avoided if Israel had responded to repeated calls to end its closure of Gaza. If Israel wanted to put a stop to the humanitarian convoys headed for Gaza, then obviously all it needed to do was to lift the illegal economic blockade that was causing the humanitarian crisis in the first place. And yet so averse was the panel to dropping the charade that the naval blockade was designed to interdict weapons, and thus exposing Israel to the charge of collective punishment, that it completely ignored this option in its analysis of the blockade's legality. Spurious proposition number 5. The Israeli naval blockade achieved its security objective without causing disproportionate harm to Gaza's civilian population. Whereas the Turkel Report defended the legality of the siege as a whole, the UN panel endeavored to preempt the scandal of such a broad legal writ by redefining the naval siege as a thing apart, the legality of which rose and fell on its own merits. Thus, According to the panel, even if the land blockade was designed to prevent humanitarian goods from reaching Gaza, it did not necessarily make the naval blockade illegal. The panel's audacious surgical procedure did not, however, salvage Israel's case. In fact, it rendered Israel's case yet more untenable. The panel contended that in the absence of significant port facilities in Gaza, the harm caused by the naval blockade to Gaza's civilian population was slight, and consequently not disproportionate to the military gain. But if, as the evidence unambiguously showed, the Israeli naval blockade did not serve the purpose of self-defense against an armed attack but was imposed to achieve a political objective, then the proportionality test was wholly irrelevant. As the panel itself observed, the imposition of a blockade must have a lawful military objective. Put otherwise, even if the humanitarian value of the maritime point of entry were minimal, the naval blockade would still cause proportionally greater harm because its military value was nil. It was not put in place to deter weapons smuggling or achieve any other legitimate military objective, while the visit and search procedure, which did not hinder the passage of humanitarian goods, could have neutralized the speculative threat of such smuggling. In addition, even if the naval blockade did subserve an actual military objective, it would still have been hasty to conclude that it did not cause disproportionate damage. The Turkel Report itself cautioned against being too dismissive of Gaza's potential for maritime traffic, not least because it undercut Israel's rationale for imposing a blockade. If goods could just barely enter Gaza by sea, then weapons too could just barely enter. But in that case a naval blockade would be redundant and any justification for it unsustainable. The absence of a commercial port is not a decisive factor, since it is clear that it is possible to find other ways of transporting goods arriving by sea, such as by means of unloading the goods with the help of fishing boats. Moreover, the assumption that goods cannot be transported into the Gaza Strip in the absence of a commercial port inherently contradicts the main purpose of the blockade, i.e., preventing the passage of weapons to the Gaza Strip, since, according to the same logic, it would not be at all possible to transport weapons to the Gaza Strip by sea. The furthest the Turkel Report would venture was that, in the absence of information and records, it is difficult to determine the effect of the naval blockade alone on the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. It cannot but perplex how the panel ascertained that the potential harm of the naval blockade was slight, when even the egregiously apologetic Turkel Report pleaded agnosticism. In fact, if a humanitarian crisis existed in Gaza, and if the maritime passageway was the last and only remaining point of entry to Gaza's besieged population, then the collateral damage of the naval blockade would have to be reckoned severe, while the likelihood of Israel passing a proportionality test would be drastically reduced. The panel rejected this calculation of proportionality, as it downplayed the humanitarian potential of a maritime passageway to Gaza. Smuggling weapons by sea is one thing, delivering bulky food and other goods to supply a population of approximately 1.5 million people is another. But the reverse could just as easily be said: smuggling bulky weapons by sea is one thing, delivering desperately needed medicines and other basic, portable goods to supply a population. The upshot was that if the panel's proportionality test vindicated Israel, that's because it was based on false premises, while the blockade almost certainly couldn't have passed a proportionality test anchored squarely in the factual situation. Lest it be forgotten, the panel's spurious proportionality test did not just vindicate Israel, it also condemned Gaza's civilian population to a stringent blockade, not only from land but also from sea, as it suffered a humanitarian crisis. To be sure, however large a breach in the naval blockade, it could not have solved Gaza's humanitarian disaster. The overarching objective of the flotillas was, in fact, not to deliver humanitarian cargo but rather to shine a bright light on the illegality and inhumanity of the blockade. The panel found this last objective, if not legally then, still, morally culpable. The UN panel presented a sequence of interrelated propositions to legally justify Israel's naval blockade of Gaza. If any of these propositions proved to be false, the panel could not have sustained its defense of the siege. It turns out that each and every one of the propositions proves on close inspection to be spurious. The Israeli naval blockade was related to the Israeli land blockade. Israel did not confront a novel security threat from Gaza's coastal waters when it imposed the naval blockade. Israel did not impose the naval blockade in response to a security threat. The naval blockade was not the only means Israel had at its disposal to meet the alleged security threat, and the Israeli naval blockade could achieve its alleged security objective only by causing disproportionate harm to Gaza's civilian population. It would be hard to exaggerate the sheer mendacity of the multiplex rationale contrived by the panel to justify the naval blockade. But the panel did not just shamelessly legitimize Israel's illegal, immoral, and inhuman siege. It also denounced the dangerous and reckless act of the flotilla passengers as they attempted to breach this blockade. It went on to exhort states to actively intervene so as to prevent these irresponsible undertakings in the future. It is important that such events are not repeated. It is important that states make every effort to avoid a repetition of the incident. It is in the interests of the international community to actively discourage attempts to breach a lawfully imposed blockade. The fate and future of the people of Gaza, the panel suggested, would be better served by and should be the exclusive preserve of states, not ordinary citizens. Consider, however, what transpired when the international community of states did control Gaza's fate and future. In 2007, Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza that as a form of collective punishment constituted a flagrant violation of international law. The international community did not lift a finger. Journeying to Gaza around this time, former High Commissioner for Human Rights Mary Robinson declared that Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. The international community still did not lift a finger. In 2008, Israel tightened the blockade, bringing Gaza's infrastructure, in the words of an Israeli human rights organization, to the brink of collapse. The international community still did not lift a finger. The breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us, Harvard political economist Sarah Roy publicly anguished. But there is little international response, beyond UN warnings which are ignored. In late 2008, Israel invaded Gaza and in the course of what Amnesty called 22 days of death and destruction, massacred the civilian population and laid waste the civilian infrastructure. In early 2009, the UN Security Council finally reacted to global outrage at Israel's crimes by passing a resolution, 1860, that expressed grave concern at the deepening humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and called for the unimpeded provision and distribution throughout Gaza of humanitarian assistance, including of food, fuel, and medical treatment. But Israel persisted in its strangulating blockade, and the international community still did not lift a finger. It was only after the martyrdom of the Mavi Marmara passengers, as the panel itself effectively conceded, that the world's leaders suddenly experienced the epiphany that the Israeli blockade was unsustainable, and some, albeit grossly insufficient, relief was granted to Gaza's desperate civilian population. But if the panel had its way, and the Freedom Flotilla had not committed a dangerous and reckless act that infringed on the prerogatives of states, Israel would have been left undisturbed and the people of Gaza left to languish and expire. The achievements of the flotilla may have ultimately proved marginal, but in the kingdom of justice it could hardly be faulted. The passengers put their lives at risk, and several were martyred, so that the people of Gaza could breathe. What did the community of states do except saturate the atmosphere with continuous emissions of hot air? Whereas the UN panel did deem the deaths caused by Israeli commandos aboard the Mavi Marmara unacceptable, it strove hard to balance this criticism by also casting doubt on the passengers' motive. The Turkel Report had alleged that the organizers of the Mavi Marmara were jihadis hell-bent on killing Israelis. It had some difficulty sustaining this charge, however, as the most lethal weapons smuggled on board by these alleged jihadis, according to the Turkel Report itself, were slingshots and glass marbles, while it was hard to explain why these young, burly, fanatical men did not manage to kill anyone, not even the 3 commandos who were being held captive by them. Just as the panel adopted a novel strategy to prove the legality of the blockade, so it also conjured a creative proof to vindicate the Turkel Report's traducing of these alleged jihadis. The panel gravely observed that it seriously questions the true nature and objectives of the flotilla organizers. Why? Because it discovered that they intended not only to deliver humanitarian relief but also to generate publicity about the situation in Gaza. To clinch its indictment, the panel reproduced with a great flourish this document, prepared by the organizers. Purposes of this journey are to create an awareness amongst world public and international organizations on the inhumane and unjust embargo on Palestine and to contribute to end this embargo, which clearly violates human rights, and delivering humanitarian relief to the Palestinians. If this statement of intent weren't incriminating enough, the panel laid out yet more evidence of the sinister and nefarious plot. The number of journalists embarked on the ships gives further power to the conclusion that the flotilla's primary purpose was to generate publicity. It must be a first, and surely marks a nadir, in the annals of the United Nations that a report bearing its imprimatur vilified the victims of a murderous assault, because they sought to cast light on an ongoing crime against humanity.